I would like to ask you to turn in your Bibles to Philippians chapter 2 and verse 12, where Paul says, "Wherefore, my beloved, as ye have always obeyed, not in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling." This, of course, is a very striking statement in the Bible. And Paul acknowledges the nature of these remarkable Philippian brethren who had supported Paul through thick and thin, and they were not people who had a lot of money, but they were there to support his work and to be a tremendous encouragement to them, to him. And he makes a remarkable statement about them. That is, they obeyed the God of heaven, but not just because he was there. They obeyed even when he was absent. And that meant that their obedience to God was not connected to some human. It was connected to God. And then he makes this kind of startling statement: work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. Here we are made aware of the fact that in the issue of salvation, that salvation is not one-sided. God has a big part, but he does not do it all. And humans have a part, and their part is much smaller than the part of God, but humans are required to do their part. Now, we cannot merit our own salvation, but we are responsible for ourselves. And that means that there is a true sense in which we must be independent Christians, converted to God and to God only, and to no human. And by an independent Christian, I simply mean that regardless of what happens around us, whatever the circumstances may be, we are still going to be faithful to God. Now, I cannot obey God for you, and you cannot obey God for me. And neither must my godliness be so joined to your godliness that if you were to be unfaithful, that would cause me to be unfaithful. And yet there are many, many people who at least wear the name of Christian. And because they have either failed to understand these matters or failed to practice them, on some level, they never really feel a personal responsibility for their own salvation. Now, salvation is a gift. As I mentioned a moment ago, you cannot earn it. You cannot merit salvation. But the fact that it is a gift does not mean there's nothing to do, because a gift has to be appropriated. There are things we have to do to appropriate the gift. Others have never really been converted to Christ. And so if their favorite preacher moves, or if someone that they look up to grows unfaithful, then it's not long until they themselves are discouraged and they either forsake God outright, or somehow they set in motion events that will eventually dismantle their faith, because their conversion was never directly to God. God expects us to be committed to him above everybody and everything else. And God expects us to avoid at all costs any allegiance or dedication or dependence upon any person or persons or things that would diminish or interfere with this independent relationship and the responsibility that we have to God and to ourselves and to our fellow man. Joshua was one of the great leaders of God through all times. And when you go to the Old Testament, there's one thing that there are many things that will strike you, but this is a big thing to hit you. Most of the time, the people of God were not faithful to God. But occasionally, there would be these great leaders, these great men of God, and they would have an influence for good. Now, Joshua was one of those great men. But in spite of the tremendous strength and influence that he had, the majority of the people, of the children of God, had forsaken God. And so in Joshua chapter 24, verse 15, Joshua offers a very interesting challenge to the people. And it seems to be that there were some who were sitting on the fence. By that I mean they seem to have had some allegiance to the God of heaven, and they seem to have allegiance to these different idols, as if it would be possible to be allegiant to both. And so Joshua says, if it seems evil unto you to serve the Lord, choose you this day whom you will serve. Now this is the challenge. You know, if you're having all this trouble serving God, then make a choice today, not tomorrow, today, this day, and make a choice about whom it is that you're going to serve. Whether the gods which your fathers served, which are on the other side of the flood, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you now dwell, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Very powerful statement. Now I can tell you about my choice. Joshua says, we are going to serve the Lord, but you're going to have to make a choice. You can worship the God of the Amorites, and the children of Israel seem to be very adept at worshiping whatever extant God they seem to be associated with or in the area with. But as for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. That was an independent statement of dependence upon God. Joshua was a great man of God, and because of his allegiance to God above everything else, Joshua didn't have any trouble knowing which way to go. And Joshua was fairly alone in his service to God. Almost all of his brethren and kinsmen had gone to serve other gods. But there never was a time that discouraged Joshua. Why? And I think that's an important question for all of us. Why is it that almost everybody that you are associated with in life, that you have a close bond to, every one of them have forsaken the God of heaven, but it didn't discourage him? And that's a great issue for us. And it was because Joshua's relationship to God was not dependent on anyone else, including members of his own family. Joshua had independent godliness. He was committed to God and to God only. And therefore, whatever his family did, his brethren, his fellow man, it may have broken his heart, but it did not change his commitment. Over the years, I have known of many Christians who seemed at some point in their life to be faithful, but if their husband, wife, or someone else that they were associated with or someone else that they loved grew unfaithful, then they grew unfaithful. They were people who never really had the right relationship to God. Sometimes your mate may die and you're alone. And the strength of the family might have been in the mate, not in you. And what you find out is that it's not long until the devil comes to challenge the weakness that's in you. But you must remember one thing. The words of the Apostle Paul to the Philippian brethren, you obey God whether I'm there or not there. You know, there are a lot of people who are on some level converted to others, and their strength is really only as strong as the people that they have latched onto. But there's not independent strength, no real relationship with God. Because when you have the right relationship with God, no disillusionment, no discouragement, no misfortune can influence a person to forsake God. So the issue was simple for Joshua. He was converted to God, and as a result of that, though he was surrounded, literally surrounded by people who claim to be servants of God and yet who had forsaken God, it never discouraged his way. It never got him off course. It never diminished his love or belief in God one moment. In 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 7 through 11, there are these amazing words of the Apostle Paul. He said, I have fought the good fight, I have finished my course, I have kept the faith. And therefore, or henceforth, there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give me at that day. And not to me only, but unto all them that love his appearing. Do thy diligence to come shortly unto me. And then hear these very tragic words. For Demas hath forsaken me, having loved this present world, and he is departed unto Thessalonica. And then the lamentable words of verse 11, only Luke is with me. You know, Demas, who had been such a support and help to Paul, he had gone. He loved this present world. That had to be a discouraging thing. And then you look and you're looking for, well, who's there to help me out? Well, only Luke is with me. Of course, that would be a lot. You know, it's better to have one person that really loves you and really faithful than to have a bunch of people who aren't. But what lamentable words. But then notice how he began. I have fought the good faith. I have finished the course. I have kept the faith. Do you mean you've done all that in spite of Demas's and people like Demas? Yes. Paul was a great man of God, a great missionary. He had encountered a vast amount of discouraging things in his Christian life. But nothing ever influenced Paul to forsake God. You know, Demas had been a close associate, a fellow laborer. At one point, he appears not only to have been a faithful Christian, but also a dear friend. Paul had depended on Demas. He needed Demas's help and support. In fact, Paul was at this time awaiting a trial before Nero, and I guess if there had ever been a time to where Paul needed somebody to help him, it would have been at that time. And yet, Demas, at the point of the greatest need, forsook him, having loved this present world. Did this disillusionment, this great discouragement, cause Paul to give up and forsake God? You know, when a time comes that events change in our lives and events of discouragement happen, it could be death or anything else, and somehow that affects our loyalty to God. That means that our loyalty to God is not there. And it either never was there, or if it was there, somehow along the way it was lost. Now, you know, Paul could have done what a lot of people would do. He could have followed Demas into the world. But no, sir, that was never even a consideration. You know, the people that we love and respect most in life can forsake us and God. People we look up to, elders, preachers, deacons, members of our own family, our husbands, our wives, our brothers, our sisters, our country, our community, our schools. You can make a list as long as your leg. But because we are converted to God, none of that really makes any difference. Humans forsake us, but God never does. Humans betray us, but God never does. You know, sometimes in life we can have disappointment. I have no doubt that the words of Paul expressed disappointment in Demas. And not only in Demas, but the fact that others had forsaken him. And yet that did not change anything at all. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 23 through 27, are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. I am more, in labors more abundant, in stripes above measure, in prison more frequent, in deaths oft. Of the Jews, 5 times I received 40 stripes, save one. Thrice was I beaten with rods, once was I stoned, thrice I suffered shipwreck. A night and a day I have been in the deep. In journeying often in perils of waters, in peril of robbers, in perils of mine own countrymen, in perils by the heathen, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness and painfulness, in watching often, in hunger and thirst, in fasting often, in cold and nakedness. You know what? It wouldn't take but any one of those things on that list to discourage the average person. Sometimes we listen. You ever listen to yourself about the excuses that we make about in forsaking God? But here's this very long list of terrible things. Everything on this list is a terrible thing. Never discourage Paul. Not one time. Because his relationship was independent. He was an independent Christian, which meant that his relationship was to God and therefore not dependent on anybody or anything. I would like to end by offering a few suggestions that will help all of us to be independent Christians. First of all, we need to make sure that we are really converted. In 2 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 5, examine your own selves, whether you be in the faith, prove your own selves. And in this passage is a command to test ourselves, to make sure that we are what we claim to be, that we are Christians, not because of someone else and our love for someone else, but because of our love for God. In John 1, verses 40 and 50, one of the two which heard John speak and followed him was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. He first findeth his own brother Simon, and saith unto him, We have found the Messiah, which is being interpreted, the Christ. You know, many people would not have ever maybe heard of Christ in that period of time, had it not been for those men, one of whom told the other. So the point is, we have responsibility to others. We are in the business as Christians of saving souls. But if a person becomes a Christian just because they want to make someone else happy, then that will not work. That's not intrinsic obedience. It won't last because it's not born of conviction. In Romans chapter 6, verse 17, but God be thanked that ye were the servants of sin, but you have obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine which was delivered unto you. That's the key. Obedience from the heart, really meaning it. You know, it's one thing to do something from your heart. It's another thing to do it for another reason. God's interested in the heart stuff, the genuine stuff, the real stuff. Secondly, we need to realize that anybody in our lives can fall from grace. They can disappoint us. The most faithful Christian can sin and forsake God. And when someone that we look up to forsakes God, what it ought to do instead of discouraging us, it ought to make us more careful about our own spirituality. Sometimes you look at somebody who is so strong and yet they themselves become weak and fall. And instead of being discouraged by that, we ought to say, wait a minute, that could happen to me. It ought to make us more resolved to serve God, not less resolved. When we see the tragedy of a person who had salvation in their own hands and then for whatever reason forfeited it, one is then looking at a tragedy, a tremendous tragedy. The type of tragedy that we would have if someone we deeply love died. Have you ever known of someone who had a lot of money, a lot of wealth, and because of foolish investments, they may lose it all? We deal with a company that is a worldwide company, and we were in New York City, not this year, but in 2020, and we were listening to how they were talking to us about how they were focusing their the investments in their company. And we happened to know them, so they shared that with us. But when we left, all of us, our group of three, we were talking among ourselves about how foolish that was. They are now teetering on bankruptcy in about a year. So you make a bad investment, and then you have the events of COVID come, and the next thing you know, you're in a lot of trouble. But the fact that someone is foolish who has a lot of wealth and then they lose their wealth, would that make you want to go and follow them and get rid of all of your wealth? Or would it make you more cautious? Would it make you say, wait a minute, if people like this who have built a successful business can make one stupid decision and that decision destroy their wealth, I'm going to have to be more careful about my investments and more careful about my money. Isn't it funny how we can see the money angle of it quicker than we can see the spiritual angle, the angle involved with spirituality? Third, we need to make sure that we do not allow the conflicts of life to be discouraging to us. The Apostle Paul was a great man. Barnabas was a great man. They were both great men of God. They had a really big-time disagreement. I don't mean a little disagreement. They had a big-time disagreement, and it was over John Mark. And if you were to listen to the argumentation of both of those men, you would have to come away and say both of those men had valid ways of thinking. You have Barnabas over here, and he is thinking about the welfare of John Mark. And he sees that even though John Mark has really messed up, that this man can get past the messed up part and go on to be a great man, which, by the way, is exactly what happened. And later on, Paul acknowledges it. But Paul was a different type of fellow. He's the kind of fellow that said, no, wait a minute. We're out here and we're in this missionary work, and John Mark failed us big time, and I cannot take a chance with him. I've got to have somebody I can count on. Both of those are great arguments. And Paul and Barnabas could have had a falling out and never spoken to each other again. But no, that's not what happened. Paul took some folks and went this way, and Barnabas took John Mark and went that way. But they were both working for God, and they never stopped loving each other, and they never lost their faith or their friendship. And there's a great lesson here for us. We must never allow any conflict to cause us to forsake God. We must not allow anybody to cause us to jeopardize our faith. You know, neither must we let other problems discourage us, like illness or death or financial reverses or a big long list of things that can happen. I cannot tell you the number of people in my preaching life that I have seen forsake God because their mate died. I mean, it's been a bunch. And I have known people who got ill and forsook God. In fact, used their illness to forsake God. Years ago, I knew a family, and there was a tragic accident. You know, this family was considered to be one of the pillar families of this congregation. This boy had a wreck in a truck, a freak accident, paralyzed for life. The whole family lost their faith. How could God let this happen? What a stupid question for any human to ask. Shows you how poorly they thought. It shows you how disconnected they were to God, how non-converted they were to God. So when the circumstances of life changed and became negative, the show was over for them. I don't mean show, but they were finished. They walked out of the theater. No more God. So what kind of relationship is that? Do you end a relationship because somebody discourages you? Do you end a relationship with someone because they disappoint you? I would love to have a day in my life to where I didn't disappoint at least one person, and maybe more. And it would be great to have a day to where I never did anything wrong, or never was foolish or stupid. And you probably have days to where you don't have that. I don't have many. So what am I supposed to do? What are you supposed to do? In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 7 to 11, "And lest I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of the revelations, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. For this thing I besought the Lord thrice or 3 times, that it might depart from me. And he said unto me, My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of God may rest upon me. And therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, in distresses for Christ's sake, for which I am weak, and then I am strong. Boy, if you want to read a profound text, that's it. You know, Paul says, I think this is an interesting insight that Paul has in himself. You know, Paul is the big guy, so to speak. All these revelations have come. He is one of the principal guys in the entire New Testament. He is a champion of God. And Paul is saying, it could have gone to my head. But I have an infirmity, and he says it's from Satan. Who knows what it was? You know, there's been all these discussions about what Paul's infirmity was. It seems to have been some sort of physical thing or whatever. We don't really know. And there are great arguments to be made on all sides of the issue. But when everything is said and done, we don't know. But whatever it was, Paul said, I asked the Lord 3 times to take it away from me. And the Lord said, no, sir. I'm not going to take it away. I'm going to let you have it. I'm going to let you keep it. Because you need it. And I will give you strength to deal with it and overcome it. But I'm not going to take it away. Could God have taken it away? Yes, sir. Why didn't he? Because Paul needed that infirmity. I want to end by telling you a true story. Many years ago, when we lived in the state of Missouri, and I preached in Missouri, there was a young woman who had kidney failure pretty early in her life. And she got into the long list of people who were going to get a new kidney. And, that can be quite a wait. And back then, I think it was a long wait. And this girl, who was a Christian, never missed a service with her mother, unless there was there were times because she would have physical problems and be unable to. Never missed a service. There were continual prayers from the church for her to get a new kidney. So about 2 years later, or I may be wrong about the time, but near that 2 years, could have been 3. I don't know how long it was. It was a long time. Church is always praying, always praying. Got a phone call. She's going to get this kidney. Boy, we rejoiced. We got her the kidney. Well, I mean, we didn't. God got her the kidney, but all these prayers were answered. So she had this surgery, and, back then it was a more dramatic thing than it would be today. I mean, it's very risky even today, but, not as risky today as it was then. She went through that surgery, sailed through it. And we never saw her at another service ever again. I asked her mother, I said, is she able to come? Oh, yeah. She's going to the bars and the nightclubs. And I said, are you kidding me? And she said, no. She said, my heart is broken. She'd have been better off if she'd have never gotten that kidney. That was her infirmity. But even if she had gotten it, whether she did or didn't, she was never converted to God. And the minute she got her kidney back, she went back to the lifestyle that she had lived before, went right back in the world. I never did know what happened to her. Eventually we moved away from Missouri, and I never knew what happened. But that's an example of the types of things that I've been talking about today. And I will never forget how heartbroken that mother was. All these prayers, all the time. She worked so hard to take care of her daughter in these extremely hard times. But the minute that daughter got that kidney, she was gone. She was gone from Mom, and she was gone from God. I'll tell you, sometimes in life, We look at problems we have and hard times and difficulties, and we think about how terrible all that is, but it may be a blessing. It might keep us thinking right. It might keep us living right. Because if the dynamics were to change, the devil might be able to use it in a way that would be so harmful and so deadly to us. So I would ask you today, to whom are you converted? To the God of heaven? To your job, your family, your husband, your wife, your dog? I hate to bring up dogs, but there are people who love their dogs more than they love humans. Your health, your this, your that. Some person, some place. What are you converted to? What am I converted to? Because if it's not to God and God only, independently, then we are doomed to failure. It's just a matter of time. If you're not a Christian, I beg you to come today in faith, having heard the word of God, believing it, repenting of sins, confessing that Jesus is the Son of God, being baptized for remission of sins. And if you are a Christian in need of public confession, please come while we stand and sing.